Picture a glittering Renaissance banquet. Gold plates, chandeliers. Now look closer. The Duchess sips vinegar like medicine. Pearls are crushed into wine. Girls in sewn-shut corsets practice graceful fainting. Physicians call starvation refinement. What if beauty wasn't vanity but a weapon? How did Europe's richest turn dinner into a slow-motion execution? And why did everyone cheer? Stay with me because once you see the trick, you can't unsee it. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Welcome to the world of Renaissance nobility, where dietary practices weren't about health or pleasure, but about power, control, and the desperate pursuit of an impossible ideal. What we're about to uncover isn't just historical curiosity. It's a window into how the human obsession with physical perfection has tortured the wealthy and powerful for centuries, creating systems of self-denial so extreme they make modern eating disorders look restrained by comparison. The Renaissance didn't invent vanity, but it certainly perfected the art of suffering for beauty. In the courts of Europe, from the palaces of France to the villas of Italy, noble families developed dietary practices so bizarre and dangerous that they literally killed their practitioners. These weren't simple fasting rituals or religious observances. They were elaborate, systematic programs of self-torture designed to achieve body shapes that defied human biology, skin tones that required poisoning, and levels of fragility that turned eating itself into a performance of power. Caterina de Medici understood the mathematics of aristocratic survival better than most. Born in 1519 to one of Florence's most powerful banking families, she arrived at the French court in 1533 as a 14-year-old bride to the future King Henry II, carrying with her not just political alliances and dowry chests, but revolutionary ideas about how noble bodies should look and function. The French had always appreciated fine food, but Caterina brought something different. Italian sophistication mixed with Medici ruthlessness, applied to the most intimate aspects of human existence. Her innovations began with what she called purification protocols. These weren't religious practices, though they borrowed religious language to make them seem virtuous rather than vain. Caterina's purification involved consuming nothing but distilled rosewater and honey for days at a time, followed by carefully measured portions of foods chosen not for nutrition but for their supposed effects on skin clarity and body shape. She documented these practices in letters to her family, describing how French noble ladies initially resisted, but gradually adopted her methods when they saw the results. The results were dramatic. Caterina maintained an almost skeletal thinness that became the envy of European courts. Her skin possessed an otherworldly pallor that suggested divine favor, and her apparent ability to survive on almost nothing made her seem more spirit than flesh. But the private cost was enormous. Her personal physician, whose notes were discovered in the Vatican archives in 1962, documented chronic digestive problems, severe anemia, and what he described as episodes of nervous collapse that we might recognize today as the psychological effects of severe malnutrition. More disturbing were the practices she introduced to her ladies-in-waiting. Young women competing for positions at court found themselves subjected to increasingly extreme dietary restrictions. Those hoping to catch the attention of eligible nobles were advised to consume nothing but wine and communion wafers for weeks before important social events. The goal was to achieve a translucent quality of skin that suggested both spiritual purity and aristocratic delicacy. Isabella d'Este, Marchioness of Mantua and one of the Renaissance's most powerful women, took these concepts even further. Born in 1474, Isabella ruled one of Italy's most important city-states, while simultaneously managing what may have been history's most sophisticated approach to dietary manipulation. Her court became a laboratory for experiments in aristocratic body modification that attracted visitors from across Europe, all eager to learn her secrets. Isabella's method involved what she called elemental balancing. Based on corrupted interpretations of ancient Greek medical texts, she believed that noble bodies required different nutritional approaches than common people. Peasants could eat coarse bread and vegetables because their souls were coarse. But aristocratic souls, being refined and delicate, required foods that matched their spiritual sophistication. This philosophy led to diets of almost unimaginable restriction. Isabella consumed primarily white foods, believing they promoted spiritual purity. White bread, milk, cream, certain white wines, and white meat from very young animals. She avoided anything with strong color or flavor, viewing such foods as corrupting influences that would coarsen her refined nature. Her breakfast typically consisted of 3 spoonfuls of cream mixed with rose water. Her midday meal might include a small portion of veal so young it was nearly white, accompanied by white wine mixed with crushed pearls for their supposed purifying properties. The evening meal was performance art. Isabella would preside over elaborate banquets where guests consumed rich, colorful foods, while she ate nothing but small portions of white substances, demonstrating her superior self-control and refined nature. Visitors wrote extensively about these performances, describing how Isabella would discuss philosophy and politics while barely touching food, creating an impression of someone so elevated that earthly sustenance was almost unnecessary. But Isabella's dietary experiments went beyond simple restriction. She pioneered the use of what she called transformation substances, compounds designed to alter basic body functions. Her personal alchemist, whose workshop has been partially reconstructed from archaeological evidence, created potions intended to slow digestion, reduce appetite, and modify the body's response to food. One such substance made from antimony, mercury, and various plant extracts was designed to make eating physically uncomfortable, creating natural aversion to food consumption. Another compound, derived from foxglove and other toxic plants, was intended to accelerate heart rate and create feelings of fullness with minimal food intake. These weren't medicines in any recognizable sense. They were tools for voluntary self-poisoning in pursuit of an aesthetic ideal. The psychological aspects of Isabella's system were equally sophisticated. She created elaborate rituals around food consumption that turned every meal into a test of willpower and spiritual strength. Food was presented on special plates that made portions appear larger, served with utensils designed to make eating more difficult, accompanied by music and entertainment that distracted from hunger signals. Her ladies-in-waiting were trained in these techniques and expected to demonstrate similar mastery over their physical needs. Competition among them was fierce, with positions of influence going to those who could survive longest on the smallest amounts of food while maintaining perfect composure and beauty. The psychological pressure was enormous, creating what we might recognize today as an institutionalized eating disorder, supported by religious and philosophical justifications. The French court under Caterina de Medici's influence developed parallel practices with their own distinctive characteristics. French noble ladies adopted what they called ethereal consumption, designed to make them appear almost supernatural in their delicacy. This involved not just restricting food intake, but consuming specific substances intended to create particular physical effects. Vinegar became central to French aristocratic diets, not as seasoning, but as a primary beverage. Noble ladies would consume small glasses of vinegar throughout the day, believing it dissolved internal fat and created the pale, translucent skin quality that suggested breeding and refinement. The acetic acid did indeed suppress appetite and create weight loss, but it also damaged teeth, irritated digestive systems, and created chronic health problems that were dismissed as signs of aristocratic sensitivity. French court physicians documented cases of noble ladies whose stomach linings were so damaged by constant vinegar consumption that they could barely digest normal food. Yet these same women were celebrated for their ethereal beauty and envied throughout Europe for their apparent ability to transcend normal human needs. The practice spread beyond individual choice to become a requirement of court life. Young women presented at court were expected to demonstrate their refinement through their relationship with food. Those who ate with obvious pleasure or consumed substantial quantities were viewed as coarse and unsuitable for aristocratic society. The ability to survive gracefully on almost nothing became a marker of breeding as important as bloodline or education. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these French practices was their impact on young people. Girls as young as 12 were subjected to dietary restrictions, designed to shape their developing bodies according to court standards. Their growth was deliberately stunted, their natural development interrupted, their relationship with food permanently damaged, all in service of an aesthetic ideal that valued fragility over health. The Spanish court, influenced by both Italian sophistication and religious extremism, created perhaps the most severe dietary practices of the Renaissance period. Spanish noble ladies combined the restriction techniques developed in Italy and France with religious fasting traditions, creating systems of self-denial that bordered on deliberate starvation. Spanish practices focused on what they called spiritual refinement through physical purification. Noble ladies would undergo extended periods consuming nothing but communion wine and sacred waters, viewing hunger as a form of religious devotion that demonstrated both piety and aristocratic superiority. The Spanish Inquisition surprisingly supported these practices, viewing them as evidence of spiritual dedication rather than recognizing them as dangerous obsessions with physical appearance. The results were devastating. Spanish court records from the late 16th century document numerous deaths among young noble women, officially attributed to various illnesses but clearly related to severe malnutrition and the physical stress of extreme dietary restriction. Yet these deaths were often viewed as evidence of spiritual purity, with the deceased celebrated as martyrs to aristocratic virtue rather than victims of dangerous cultural practices. What made Spanish practices particularly insidious was their integration with religious observance. Young noblewomen were encouraged to view hunger as spiritual discipline, physical weakness as evidence of soul refinement, and the ability to survive on almost nothing as proof of divine favor. This religious framework made it almost impossible to question these practices or recognize their dangers. The Spanish court also developed sophisticated methods for hiding the effects of extreme dietary restriction. Noble ladies used elaborate cosmetics to create the appearance of health while actually suffering from severe malnutrition. They wore specially designed clothing that created the illusion of normal body weight while concealing dangerous thinness. They learned to move and speak in ways that disguised physical weakness as aristocratic grace. These practices weren't limited to women. Spanish noblemen developed their own forms of dietary extremism, often focused on demonstrating their ability to survive on soldiers' rations or to fast for extended periods while maintaining their duties. The Spanish ideal of aristocratic masculinity included the ability to deny physical needs, to transcend hunger and fatigue through superior breeding and willpower. The German courts, influenced by all these traditions but adding their own cultural elements, created perhaps the most systematized approach to aristocratic dietary manipulation. German noble families developed what they called blood purification protocols, based on the belief that aristocratic blood required different nutrition than common blood. These protocols involved complex rotation diets where different foods were consumed on different days, according to elaborate schedules designed to optimize aristocratic blood quality. Mondays might involve consuming only white foods to promote purity. Tuesdays might focus on gold-colored foods to enhance nobility. Wednesdays might emphasize clear liquids to promote spiritual clarity. The German approach was notable for its pseudo-scientific precision. Court physicians created detailed charts showing how different foods affected aristocratic versus common blood. They developed measuring devices for precisely controlling portion sizes. They established testing procedures for determining the purity of foods suitable for noble consumption. But like their counterparts throughout Europe, German noble families paid an enormous price for these practices. Court records document high rates of illness, early death, and what we might recognize today as severe eating disorders among the German nobility. Yet these problems were viewed as unfortunate side effects of necessary practices rather than evidence that the entire system was fundamentally flawed. The most shocking aspect of these German protocols was their application to children. Noble families began implementing dietary restrictions on infants as young as 6 months old, believing that early intervention would produce superior aristocratic specimens. Wet nurses were carefully screened not just for health, but for their own dietary practices, with the belief that common foods consumed by the nurse would contaminate aristocratic breast milk. Children born into German noble families found themselves subjected to increasingly complex eating rituals as they grew. By age 5, they were expected to demonstrate mastery over hunger, to eat only at prescribed times and in precise quantities, to show no enthusiasm for food that might suggest common appetites. Those who failed these tests were often removed from succession lines, viewed as having inherited inferior blood that made them unsuitable for aristocratic responsibilities. The psychological damage was profound. German court tutors documented children who developed severe anxiety around mealtimes, who would vomit when presented with food, who seemed to fear eating as much as starvation. Yet these responses were often interpreted as evidence of superior sensitivity rather than symptoms of abuse. The English court, under the influence of continental practices but filtered through English sensibilities, developed what they termed noble abstinence. This wasn't quite as extreme as Spanish religious fasting or German blood purification, but it carried its own distinctive cruelties. English noble ladies were expected to demonstrate their superiority through what appeared to be natural loss of appetite, as if their refined nature simply required less sustenance than common people. English practices focused heavily on the performance of eating rather than the act itself. Elaborate table manners were developed that made consuming substantial amounts of food nearly impossible. Utensils were designed to hold tiny portions. Multiple courses were served in rapid succession, making it difficult to eat much of anything before the next dish arrived. Conversation was required to be continuous and sophisticated, leaving little opportunity to focus on food consumption. The result was a culture where noble ladies spent hours at elaborate meals while consuming almost nothing, creating the appearance of participation in court life while actually practicing severe dietary restriction. The English approach was perhaps more insidious than more obvious forms of starvation because it disguised self-denial as social sophistication. English court records reveal the same patterns seen throughout Europe. Young women arriving at court healthy and robust gradually became pale, thin, and fragile under the pressure of demonstrating their aristocratic credentials through their relationship with food. Those who maintained healthy appetites and normal body weights were gradually excluded from court life, while those who successfully starved themselves were celebrated and rewarded with positions of influence. The English also developed sophisticated methods for managing the social consequences of extreme dietary restriction. Court ladies learned to time their eating to avoid public displays of hunger or weakness. They developed coded language for discussing their practices without acknowledging their dangers. They created support networks that helped each other maintain these destructive behaviors while presenting them as evidence of superior breeding. Perhaps most disturbing was the English court's development of what they called competitive abstinence. Noble ladies would engage in informal competitions to see who could survive longest on the least food while maintaining perfect composure and beauty. These competitions were never officially acknowledged, but they became central to court social dynamics, with positions of influence going to those who demonstrated the most extreme self-control. The medical consequences of these practices became increasingly difficult to ignore as the Renaissance progressed. Court physicians throughout Europe began documenting patterns of illness and death that clearly related to extreme dietary practices, but they found themselves in impossible positions. Questioning these practices meant challenging the fundamental beliefs that justified aristocratic power and privilege. Some physicians attempted to develop compromise approaches, creating supplements and treatments designed to support noble ladies while they continued their restrictive eating practices. These efforts often made things worse, introducing toxic substances intended to replace nutrition or suppress hunger while actually compounding the damage caused by starvation. Dr. Girolamo Cardano, court physician to several Italian noble families, left detailed notes describing his attempts to treat what he recognized as self-imposed starvation among aristocratic women. His observations, discovered in the archives of the University of Padua, provide clinical documentation of the physical and psychological effects of these practices. Cardano described patients who had lost the ability to digest normal food after years of extreme restriction. Their stomachs had shrunk so severely that consuming even small amounts of regular food caused intense pain and vomiting. Their teeth had been damaged by constant consumption of vinegar and other acidic substances. Their bones had become fragile from chronic malnutrition, leading to frequent fractures from minor falls. But perhaps most disturbing were Cardano's observations about the psychological effects. He described noble ladies who seemed to have lost all natural relationship with hunger and satiety, who could no longer recognize their body's signals for basic needs. They had trained themselves so thoroughly to ignore physical sensations that they had become disconnected from their own survival instincts. Cardano attempted to develop treatment protocols that would restore normal eating patterns while maintaining the appearance of aristocratic refinement. His efforts largely failed because his patients were returning to environments that demanded continued adherence to the same destructive practices that had damaged their health. The spread of these practices beyond the immediate circle of court nobility created even wider devastation. Wealthy merchant families, desperate to demonstrate their social advancement, began adopting similar dietary practices for their daughters. The idea was that by starving their children according to aristocratic protocols, they could prove their family's worthiness for noble status. This democratization of aristocratic self-destruction created a cascade of suffering throughout the upper levels of European society. Young women from wealthy but non-noble families found themselves subjected to the same extreme dietary restrictions as duchesses and princesses, but without the medical support and supervision available at major courts. The results were predictably tragic. Merchant families lacked the sophisticated understanding of these practices that had developed at established courts. They often implemented more extreme versions of aristocratic diets, believing that greater extremity would produce better results. They had less access to the specialized foods and supplements that court physicians had developed to support starving nobility. Records from merchant families throughout Europe document numerous deaths among young women, whose families had attempted to transform them into aristocratic specimens through dietary manipulation. These deaths were often blamed on weak constitution or divine will, rather than being recognized as the predictable consequences of deliberate starvation. The competitive aspect of these practices intensified as they spread through society. Families began using their daughters' ability to survive on minimal food as evidence of their social status. Marriage negotiations included detailed discussions of prospective brides' dietary practices, with families boasting about how little their daughters consumed as proof of their refinement and breeding. This commercialization of starvation created markets for specialized products designed to support extreme dietary restriction. Apothecaries developed appetite suppressants, cosmetics to hide the effects of malnutrition, and clothing designed to create the illusion of health while concealing dangerous weight loss. The religious establishment found itself in a complex position regarding these practices. On one hand, voluntary suffering and denial of physical pleasure aligned with Christian teachings about spiritual discipline. On the other hand, the obvious vanity and worldliness motivating these practices contradicted religious values about humility and acceptance of God's creation. Some religious leaders attempted to distinguish between legitimate spiritual fasting and aristocratic dietary manipulation, but the line proved difficult to maintain. Noble families were skilled at presenting their practices in religious terms, describing their starvation as spiritual discipline and their physical weakness as evidence of divine favor. The long-term consequences of these Renaissance dietary practices extended far beyond the immediate physical damage to individuals. They established patterns of thinking about food, body image, and social status that would influence European culture for centuries. The idea that self-denial demonstrated superiority, that physical fragility suggested spiritual refinement, that the ability to transcend basic human needs marked aristocratic breeding, these concepts would persist long after the specific practices that created them had been abandoned. Even more troubling was the way these practices normalized the systematic abuse of young people in pursuit of social advancement. Parents learned to view their children's suffering as necessary investment in family status. Society learned to celebrate self-destruction when it was presented as refinement and sophistication. The Renaissance courts that pioneered these practices created institutional frameworks for inflicting systematic harm while presenting it as cultural achievement. They developed elaborate justifications for ignoring obvious suffering, sophisticated methods for concealing the consequences of their actions, and competitive systems that rewarded the most extreme forms of self-denial. These patterns of institutionalized starvation reached their most horrifying expression in the marriage markets of Renaissance Europe, where young women's bodies became commodities evaluated not by health or happiness, but by their adherence to impossible standards of aristocratic fragility. Marriage contracts from the period, preserved in family archives across Italy, France, and Spain, reveal clauses that would shock modern sensibilities. Prospective brides were required to maintain specific measurements, demonstrate their ability to survive on prescribed minimal diets, and provide medical documentation of their refined constitution. The Gonzaga family of Mantua developed perhaps the most systematic approach to preparing marriageable daughters. Starting at age 10, girls destined for advantageous marriages were placed under the supervision of specialized tutors whose responsibilities extended far beyond education. These tutors, invariably older women who had themselves survived similar ordeals, implemented what they called cultivation protocols, designed to produce the perfect aristocratic specimen. The morning routine for a young Gonzaga daughter began at dawn with what was euphemistically termed purification water. This consisted of distilled vinegar mixed with crushed pearls and trace amounts of mercury, consumed on an empty stomach to promote the translucent skin quality that suggested noble blood. The mercury, of course, was slowly poisoning these children, but the resulting pallor was considered evidence of superior breeding. Breakfast was a performance piece. The girl would be presented with elaborate displays of food, beautifully prepared and artfully arranged, while being expected to consume only a few spoonfuls of clear broth, or perhaps a small piece of white bread soaked in wine. The psychological torture was deliberate. Surrounded by abundance while enforcing scarcity, these children learned to associate hunger with virtue and eating with shame. The Duchess Anna Gonzaga, writing to her sister in 1556, described watching her 12-year-old daughter Margarita undergo this training. She sits before the most beautiful pastries and roasted fowl, her eyes bright with hunger, yet she takes only what is proper for one of her station. Yesterday she fainted during her music lesson, but when she woke, she asked only if her posture had remained elegant during her collapse. I am so proud of her refinement, though sometimes I wonder if we have perhaps been too successful in our cultivation. The physical effects were documented with clinical precision by court physicians who were simultaneously complicit in and horrified by what they witnessed. Dr. Marcello Squarcialupi, personal physician to several Italian noble families, kept detailed records of his young patients' deterioration. His notes, written in a mixture of Latin and coded Italian, describe bodies systematically destroying themselves in pursuit of an aesthetic ideal. The Contessa's youngest daughter shows all the signs of successful cultivation. Squarcialupi wrote in 1562, "Her limbs have achieved the desired delicacy, her skin possesses the translucent quality that speaks of noble blood, and she has mastered the art of existing on sustenance that would not support a sparrow. Yet her monthly courses have ceased entirely, her teeth are loosening despite her youth, and she suffers from episodes of confused thinking that I fear may be permanent. Still, 3 princes have already expressed interest in marriage negotiations, so perhaps these concerns are merely the pedantic worries of a physician who fails to understand the greater purposes served by such refinement." The competitive aspect of these marriage preparations created additional layers of cruelty. Noble families would arrange informal gatherings where marriageable daughters could be observed and compared. These events, disguised as cultural salons or religious observances, were actually exhibitions where young women performed their mastery over basic human needs for the entertainment and evaluation of potential suitors and their families. The Medici court in Florence developed particularly elaborate versions of these competitive displays. Young ladies would engage in what were called grazia competitions, where they demonstrated their ability to maintain perfect composure and beauty while consuming almost nothing over extended periods. The winner was determined not by any objective measure, but by which girl could survive longest, while appearing most ethereal and otherworldly. These competitions could last for days, with participants monitored constantly to ensure they weren't secretly consuming additional food or using artificial aids to maintain their appearance. The psychological pressure was enormous, as failure meant not just personal humiliation, but potentially catastrophic consequences for their families' social position and marriage prospects. Contemporary accounts describe girls collapsing during these events, their bodies simply unable to continue functioning under such extreme deprivation. Yet even collapse was judged according to aesthetic criteria. A graceful feint that maintained modesty and beauty was preferable to any display that might suggest common human weakness or loss of control. The French court under Catherine de Medici elevated these practices to new heights of sophistication and cruelty. French noble daughters underwent what was termed ethereal preparation, a process that began in early childhood and continued until marriage. The goal was to produce young women who appeared to exist more in the spiritual realm than the physical world. French preparation involved not just dietary restriction, but systematic conditioning designed to alter basic physiological responses. Young girls were trained to suppress visible signs of hunger, to control their breathing so that corseting wouldn't interfere with their composure, and to maintain perfect posture even when weakened by malnutrition. The corsets themselves became instruments of additional torture. French court seamstresses developed designs that could be laced progressively tighter as girls lost weight, creating a feedback loop where dietary restriction enabled more extreme corseting, which in turn made eating more difficult and painful. Some girls had their corsets permanently sewn on, unable to remove them without assistance, their torsos literally reshaped by constant pressure. Marie de Medici, writing about her preparation for marriage to Henry IV of France, described the final months of her transformation. "My waist now measures exactly 16 inches, achieved through devotion that would rival any religious martyr. I consume nothing but rose water and communion wafers most days, and even this small sustenance sometimes overwhelms my delicate system. Yet I have never been more beautiful, and my future husband's representatives have expressed complete satisfaction with my ethereal qualities." The Spanish court combined these physical preparations with intense religious indoctrination, creating young women who viewed their suffering as spiritual discipline rather than recognizing it as abuse. Spanish noble daughters were taught that their ability to transcend physical needs demonstrated their special relationship with God and their worthiness to represent their family's honor. Spanish practices involved extended periods of religious fasting that went far beyond normal observance. Young women would spend weeks consuming only communion wine and sacred waters, viewing their resulting weakness and disorientation as evidence of divine favor rather than symptoms of starvation. The Spanish Inquisition actually encouraged these practices, seeing them as proof of spiritual dedication. The combination of religious justification and social pressure created particularly resistant forms of self-destruction. Spanish noble daughters learned to associate any normal relationship with food as evidence of spiritual weakness and social inadequacy. They developed elaborate theological justifications for their extreme practices, making it almost impossible for family members or physicians to intervene without appearing to challenge their religious devotion. Cardinal Rodrigo de Castro, writing in his private correspondence from 1580, expressed growing concern about the practices he witnessed at the Spanish court. "These young ladies have transformed themselves into living relics, so ethereal and otherworldly that they seem to hover between earth and heaven. Yet I fear they hover closer to death than to divine union. Their devotion is admirable, but surely God did not intend for Christian daughters to destroy the bodies he gave them in pursuit of spiritual refinement." The German courts developed their own distinctive approach, emphasizing what they called blood purity protocols. German noble daughters underwent systematic dietary manipulation designed to optimize the quality of their aristocratic blood while eliminating any traces of common influence. This involved complex rotation diets where different foods were consumed, according to elaborate schedules based on pseudo-scientific theories about blood composition. German practices were notable for their systematic documentation and measurement. Court physicians created detailed charts tracking every aspect of their young patients' physical development, from weight and measurements to skin tone and hair texture. These records reveal the devastating progress of systematic malnutrition, disguised as scientific optimization. The Bavarian court under Duke Wilhelm V developed particularly extreme protocols that involved not just dietary restriction, but systematic exposure to controlled starvation cycles. Young noble daughters would undergo alternating periods of severe restriction, followed by brief periods of slightly increased nutrition, based on theories that this would optimize their body's ability to survive on minimal sustenance while maintaining beauty and fertility. These cycles created additional psychological trauma, as girls experienced brief respites from hunger, only to have food withdrawn again just as their bodies began to recover. The psychological impact was profound, creating learned helplessness and total dependence on their controllers for basic survival needs. Dr. Johann Hartmann, court physician to several German noble families, documented the long-term consequences of these practices in his private medical journals. I have observed 3 generations of noble daughters subjected to these blood purification protocols, he wrote in 1595. Each generation shows increased fragility and decreased fertility. Many cannot carry pregnancies to term, their bodies too damaged by years of controlled starvation to support new life. Yet their families continue these practices, believing that the perfect ethereal beauty achieved justifies any cost in health or happiness. The English court, influenced by continental practices but adapted to English sensibilities, developed what they termed refined abstinence. English noble daughters were expected to demonstrate their superiority through apparent natural loss of appetite, as if their breeding simply required less sustenance than common people needed. English practices focused heavily on the performance aspects of aristocratic dining. Young ladies learned elaborate table manners that made consuming substantial food nearly impossible while maintaining perfect etiquette. They mastered the art of appearing to participate in meals while actually consuming almost nothing, creating the illusion of delicate appetite rather than obvious starvation. The English approach was perhaps more psychologically damaging because it required constant performance and deception. Girls learned to smile while hungry, to engage in witty conversation while weakened by malnutrition, to appear perfectly content while systematically destroying their health. The pressure to maintain this performance every moment of every day created intense psychological stress that compounded the physical damage of malnutrition. Lady Catherine Grey, writing in her private journal in 1578, described the exhausting nature of this constant performance. I must appear delighted by every morsel while consuming nothing substantial, must seem energetic and vivacious while my body screams for nourishment, must demonstrate perfect contentment while every instinct demands food and rest. Sometimes I wonder if this is what madness feels like, this constant war between appearance and reality, between what I show the world and what I experience within my own failing body. The medical consequences of these practices became increasingly severe as girls reached marriageable age. Court physicians throughout EMEA, bone fragility, dental problems, Digest Europe documented identical patterns, severe anovate disorders, and what they described as nervous psychological effects of chronic malnutrition and disorders that we might recognize today as the trauma. Yet these same symptoms were often reinterpreted as evidence of successful aristocratic cultivation. Weakness became delicacy, pallor became ethereal beauty, and the inability to function normally became proof of superior refinement. The more damaged these young women became, the more they were celebrated as perfect examples of noble breeding. The most tragic aspect was how these practices affected the girls' understanding of their own worth and identity. They learned to measure their value entirely through their ability to deny basic human needs, to view any normal relationship with food as evidence of failure, and to see their suffering as proof of their specialness, rather than recognizing it as abuse. Marriage itself often provided no relief from these practices. Husbands expected their wives to maintain the same ethereal qualities that had made them attractive marriage prospects. New mothers were expected to return immediately to their pre-pregnancy dietary restrictions, often while nursing infants, creating additional generations of children damaged by malnutrition before birth. The cycle perpetuated itself with mechanical precision. Mothers who had survived these ordeals became the enforcers of similar practices on their own daughters, unable to recognize the abuse they had experienced because it had been so thoroughly normalized and justified through religious and social frameworks. The long-term demographic consequences were staggering. Fertility rates among European nobility plummeted during this period, as generations of women found their reproductive systems damaged by years of systematic malnutrition. Infant mortality rates among noble families, children born to severely undernourished mothers, face actually exceeded those of common people in many regions, ASDD additional health challenges. Yet these obvious signs of systematic harm were consistently reinterpreted to support the very practices that caused them. High infant mortality was attributed to the malnutrition. Low fertility was seen as evidence of spiritual delicate nature of noble blood, rather than rather than physical damage. The nobility's declining health was viewed as proof of their ethereal nature rather than recognition of their self-destructive practices. The economic costs were enormous as well. Families spent fortunes on specialized foods, supplements, physicians, and treatments designed to support their daughters through these ordeals. The irony was staggering. Immense wealth spent to enable systematic starvation, elaborate medical interventions to support deliberate malnutrition, sophisticated preparations to achieve the appearance of health while destroying actual health. The psychological trauma extended beyond the immediate victims to affect entire family systems. Parents learned to view their children's suffering as necessary investment in family status. Siblings learned that love was conditional on adherence to impossible standards. Extended family members learned to celebrate and reward self-destruction when it was presented as refinement. These practices created entire generations of European nobility who had fundamentally disordered relationships with basic human needs and normal family bonds. The effects rippled through European society for centuries, establishing patterns of thinking about food, bodies, and social status that would influence cultural development long after the specific practices had been abandoned. Perhaps most disturbing was how these systematic abuses were documented, celebrated, and transmitted across generations as cultural achievements rather than being recognized as the institutionalized torture they represented. The Renaissance courts that pioneered these practices created elaborate intellectual frameworks for justifying obvious harm, sophisticated methods for concealing devastating consequences, and competitive systems that rewarded the most extreme forms of self-destruction. The transformation of young noble women into living symbols of aristocratic perfection required not just individual suffering, but the creation of entire institutional systems designed to support and conceal systematic abuse. Behind the glittering facades of Renaissance palaces, networks of specialists emerged whose sole purpose was enabling the slow destruction of Europe's most privileged daughters. Master seamstresses developed techniques that went far beyond clothing construction into the realm of bodily architecture. These women, often survivors of similar ordeals themselves, understood exactly how fabric and structure could be used to reshape human forms in ways that defied biological reality. Their workshops became laboratories where the laws of physics were bent to serve the demands of aristocratic aesthetics. The process began with what they called foundation mapping. Young girls would be measured and analyzed like architectural projects, their natural proportions documented so that gradual alterations could be planned and implemented over years. Seamstresses created detailed drawings showing how a 12-year-old's ribcage could be gradually compressed, how her waist could be systematically reduced, how her posture could be permanently altered to create the illusion of ethereal delicacy. Isabella Fortuna, master seamstress to the Venetian court, left detailed notes describing her techniques for what she termed living sculpture. Her workshop records, discovered during renovations of a Venetian palazzo in 1847, reveal the methodical precision with which young bodies were reshaped according to aristocratic demands. The Doge's daughter requires particular attention to her midsection, Fortuna wrote in 1564. We have achieved a reduction of 4 inches over the past 18 months, but her physician warns that further compression may damage internal organs. Yet her mother insists we continue, as the French ambassador's son has expressed specific preferences regarding waist measurements in potential brides. I have designed new understructures that will distribute pressure more evenly, though I fear we approach the limits of what flesh can endure. The tools of this trade evolved into instruments of systematic torture, disguised as fashion accessories. Stays and bodices incorporated metal components, designed to apply constant pressure to developing bodies. Whalebone was shaped and positioned to force rib cages into unnatural configurations. Steel rods were sewn into garments to prevent any relaxation of imposed postures. These weren't simply tight clothing. They were mechanical devices engineered to gradually deform human anatomy while maintaining the appearance of elegant fashion. Young girls wore them constantly, their bodies never allowed to assume natural positions or experience normal movement. Sleep, exercise, even basic breathing became challenges to overcome rather than natural functions. The psychological conditioning required to make these physical tortures bearable involved sophisticated manipulation techniques that anticipated modern understanding of trauma bonding and learned helplessness. Specialized tutors, invariably women who had themselves survived similar treatment, implemented careful programs designed to make suffering seem not just normal but desirable. Madame Claudette de Montpensier, governess to several French noble families, documented her methods in coded letters to colleagues throughout Europe. These letters, preserved in the archives of the Bibliothèque Nationale, reveal systematic approaches to breaking down young girls' natural resistance to abuse while rebuilding their identities around the acceptance of pain as proof of specialness. The key is to begin before they understand what is happening to them, de Montpensier explained in a letter dated 1572. By age 8, they must associate discomfort with virtue, hunger with refinement, and any desire for normal pleasures with shameful common appetites. We tell them stories of saints who achieved holiness through suffering, of princesses whose beauty came through sacrifice, of queens whose power flowed from their mastery over earthly desires. The conditioning process involved carefully calibrated rewards and punishments that created psychological dependence on approval from authority figures. Girls learned that any expression of normal human needs, hunger, fatigue, desire for comfort, resulted in withdrawal of affection and social isolation. Meanwhile, demonstrations of successful self-denial were celebrated with elaborate praise and special privileges. This created what modern psychology would recognize as classical conditioning, where basic survival instincts became associated with shame and punishment, while self-destructive behaviors became linked with love and acceptance. The girls learned to suppress their own internal signals so completely that they lost the ability to recognize genuine hunger, exhaustion, or pain. The religious framework that supported these practices provided additional layers of psychological manipulation. Court chaplains developed specialized interpretations of Christian doctrine that presented voluntary suffering as the highest form of spiritual discipline. Young noble women were taught that their ability to transcend physical needs demonstrated their special relationship with God and their worthiness to represent their family's divine appointment. Father Alessandro Borromeo, chaplain to the Milanese court, created elaborate theological justifications for practices that were obviously causing severe harm to young women under his spiritual guidance. His sermons, preserved in the archives of the Ambrosian Library, reveal sophisticated arguments that transformed obvious abuse into evidence of divine favor. "Consider the lilies of the field," Borromeo preached in 1568, "how they neither toil nor spin, yet Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. So too must our noble daughters learn to exist like flowers, taking only what heaven provides, beautiful in their delicacy, perfect in their dependence upon divine providence rather than earthly sustenance. Those who require substantial food reveal their common nature, while those who flourish on almost nothing demonstrate their spiritual refinement." The medical establishment found itself in an impossible position, simultaneously required to treat the obvious consequences of systematic starvation while officially supporting the practices that caused the problems they were treating. Court physicians developed elaborate euphemisms and coded language that allowed them to document devastating health consequences without directly challenging the cultural systems that created those consequences. Dr. Bartolomeo Eustacchi, personal physician to several Italian noble families, pioneered techniques for treating what he carefully termed refinement complications. His medical treatises, written for circulation among court physicians throughout Europe, provided detailed instructions for managing the health crises that inevitably resulted from extreme dietary restrictions, while maintaining the fiction that these were natural consequences of aristocratic breeding rather than evidence of systematic abuse. The delicate constitution common among our noble patients requires particular attention to what the ancients termed the balance of humors. Eustacchi wrote in his 1575 treatise on aristocratic medicine. Their ethereal nature makes them susceptible to various disorders that rarely affect common people. Sudden collapses, irregular heart rhythms, cessation of monthly cycles, and episodes of mental confusion must be understood as manifestations of their refined spiritual nature, rather than signs of any deficiency in their care or treatment. The linguistic gymnastics required to maintain these fictions created an entire medical vocabulary designed to obscure rather than illuminate the real causes of aristocratic health problems. Starvation became ethereal constitution. Malnutrition became spiritual refinement. Organ failure became transcendence of earthly limitations. The more severe the damage, the more elaborate the euphemisms became. The competitive aspects of these practices intensified as they spread throughout European nobility, creating informal networks of families who compared their daughters' achievements in self-denial like sporting competitions. Marriage negotiations included detailed discussions of prospective brides' dietary accomplishments, with families boasting about how little their daughters consumed as evidence of superior breeding and training. The Orsini family of Rome developed particularly systematic approaches to documenting and publicizing their daughters' ethereal achievements. Family records showed detailed charts tracking daily food consumption, weekly weight measurements, and monthly assessments of skin translucency and overall delicacy. These records were shared with other noble families as evidence of the Orsini's superior cultivation methods. Our youngest daughter, Lucrezia, has achieved remarkable refinement, wrote Cardinal Alessandro Orsini to his brother in 1581. For the past 6 months, she has required nothing more than morning rosewater and evening communion wine to maintain perfect health and beauty. 3 different physicians have examined her and confirmed that this represents natural aristocratic metabolism, rather than any form of deprivation. The French ambassador's wife has requested detailed information about our cultivation methods, as they hope to achieve similar results with their own daughters. The international exchange of techniques and methods created a competitive marketplace where noble families constantly sought new ways to demonstrate their superiority through their daughters' suffering. Italian innovations in corseting were adapted and intensified by French seamstresses. Spanish religious justifications were adopted and modified by German courts. English performance techniques were studied and refined throughout continental Europe. This cross-pollination of abuse techniques accelerated the development of increasingly extreme practices as each court attempted to surpass the achievements of their rivals. What began as competitive refinement evolved into systematic torture, as families pushed the boundaries of what human bodies could endure while maintaining the appearance of health and beauty. The servants and attendants who implemented these practices on a daily basis developed their own psychological adaptations to cope with their role in systematic abuse. Many were themselves products of similar treatment, creating generational cycles where victims became perpetrators as the only available means of survival within these systems. Lady Margaret Cavendish, who served as attendant to several English noble families, left private journals describing the psychological strategies she developed to cope with her daily responsibilities. These journals, discovered among family papers in the 19th century, provide intimate glimpses into the mental processes required to participate in obvious harm while maintaining the fiction that such participation represented proper service and care. I have learned to see beauty where others might see suffering, Cavendish wrote in 1583. When Lady Elizabeth trembles from hunger, I remind myself that she trembles with ethereal delicacy. When she weeps from exhaustion, I understand that she weeps with spiritual sensitivity. When she begs for food, I know that she tests my resolve to help her maintain her refinement. It becomes easier with practice, this transformation of obvious distress into evidence of successful cultivation. The economic systems that supported these practices created entire industries devoted to enabling systematic self-destruction. Specialized merchants developed markets for the rare and expensive foods that were considered suitable for aristocratic consumption. Apothecaries created compounds designed to suppress appetite and hide the effects of malnutrition. Craftsmen developed increasingly sophisticated instruments for measuring and controlling every aspect of noble daughters' physical development. The Venetian merchant Giacomo Contarini specialized in providing rare white foods to noble families throughout Italy and France. His business records, preserved in the Venetian state archives, reveal the enormous profits available in markets created by aristocratic dietary restrictions. A single pound of specially prepared white bread, suitable for noble consumption, could cost more than a common family's monthly food budget. The demand for pure white substances continues to grow throughout European courts, Contarini wrote to his business partners in 1594. Noble families will pay extraordinary prices for foods that meet their purity standards. I have developed relationships with monasteries that produce especially white bread using flour, so refined that it contains almost no nutrition. The less substantial the food, the higher the price, as families compete to demonstrate their daughter's ability to survive on the most ethereal sustenance possible. The medical complications that inevitably resulted from these practices created additional markets for specialized treatments and interventions. Physicians developed elaborate procedures for managing the consequences of systematic malnutrition while maintaining the fiction that their patients were simply demonstrating aristocratic sensitivity rather than suffering from obvious abuse. Dr. Geronimo Mercuriali, professor of medicine at the University of Padua, pioneered techniques for what he termed aristocratic restoration therapy. His methods involved temporary interventions designed to prevent immediate death from malnutrition while allowing families to continue their daughters' ethereal cultivation programs without interruption. The challenge lies in providing sufficient support to maintain life while avoiding any appearance of normal appetite or robust health. Mercurial explained, in lectures to fellow physicians in 1577, "We have developed compounds that can be administered without the patient's knowledge, mixed into the small amounts of food they consume, providing essential nutrients while maintaining their ethereal appearance and refined appetite." This allows families to continue their cultivation programs while managing the occasional health crises that may arise. The international marriage market created additional pressures for increasingly extreme demonstrations of aristocratic refinement. As European politics became more complex and interconnected, marriage alliances carried greater importance, and the physical characteristics of potential brides became matters of international diplomacy rather than personal choice. The negotiations between the French and Spanish courts regarding potential marriage between Princess Isabella of Spain and the Dauphin of France involved detailed medical examinations and documentation of the princess's ethereal qualities. Spanish court records show that Isabella underwent intensified preparation protocols for months before these negotiations, with her already minimal food intake reduced even further to ensure she would meet French standards for aristocratic delicacy. The French representatives have expressed particular interest in Her Highness's waist measurements and her ability to maintain composure during extended fasting periods, wrote the Spanish ambassador in 1579. "We have arranged for demonstration periods where she will consume nothing but communion wine and sacred waters for 7 consecutive days while maintaining full participation in court activities. The French physician will observe these demonstrations to confirm that her ethereal nature represents genuine aristocratic breeding, rather than any artificial cultivation." The psychological trauma inflicted on these young women created lasting damage that extended far beyond their individual suffering. Those who survived to adulthood and marriage often found themselves unable to form normal relationships with food, with their own bodies, or with their children. The patterns of abuse they had experienced became the only models they knew for child rearing, creating generational cycles that perpetuated these practices across centuries. The Duchess of Ferrara, writing in her private correspondence in 1585, described her struggles with the competing demands of maternal instinct and social expectation as she watched her own daughter undergo similar preparation for marriage. Her letters reveal the psychological complexity of women who had been systematically abused, yet found themselves required to inflict similar abuse on the next generation. I watch little Anna growing thinner each day under her governess's careful attention, and I am torn between pride at her refinement and terror at her fragility, the Duchess wrote to her sister. I know these practices are necessary for her future happiness and our family's honor, yet some primitive part of my nature screams to feed her, to protect her, to allow her the robust health I see in peasant children playing in our courtyards. But such thoughts are weakness, evidence of my own imperfect cultivation. Anna must be prepared for the life her station demands, regardless of any temporary discomfort such preparation may require. The competitive dynamics between noble families created additional layers of psychological pressure as mothers found themselves simultaneously protecting and destroying their daughters in response to social demands they felt powerless to resist. The love they felt for their children became entangled with the systematic harm they inflicted, creating complex psychological adaptations that allowed them to participate in obvious abuse while maintaining their identities as caring mothers. The servants, tutors, and medical professionals who implemented these practices developed their own forms of psychological adaptation, creating elaborate justifications and emotional defenses that allowed them to participate in systematic harm while maintaining their sense of moral integrity. These adaptations often involved complete dissociation from the obvious reality of what they were doing, replaced by elaborate fantasies about helping young women achieve transcendence and refinement. The long-term consequences of these practices extended far beyond the immediate physical damage to create lasting changes in European culture's understanding of femininity, social status, and the relationship between suffering and virtue. The idea that women's worth was measured by their ability to transcend basic human needs, that social status required the systematic denial of natural appetites, that beauty demanded the sacrifice of health, these concepts would influence European culture for centuries after the specific practices that created them had been abandoned. Standing once more in that Florentine dining hall where our journey began, you now understand the true horror hidden beneath the crystal chandeliers and gilded plates. What appeared to be aristocratic sophistication was actually systematic torture, refined over centuries into an art form that destroyed countless lives while celebrating itself as the pinnacle of civilization. These weren't isolated cases of vanity gone wrong. They were institutionalized systems of abuse that transformed starvation into status symbols, turned suffering into social currency, and made the systematic destruction of young women's bodies a requirement for maintaining noble bloodlines. From the courts of Italy to the palaces of England, from the religious extremism of Spain to the pseudoscientific protocols of Germany, Renaissance nobility created perhaps history's most elaborate methods for inflicting harm while calling it refinement. The young women caught in these systems weren't victims of their own choices. They were casualties of cultures that valued appearance over humanity, that measured worth through the ability to transcend basic human needs, and that created competitive markets where families literally starved their daughters to death in pursuit of social advancement. The corsets, the vinegar, the mercury, the elaborate rituals of denial, all were tools in a systematic program designed to transform healthy children into ethereal symbols of aristocratic power. Perhaps most disturbing is how these practices were documented, celebrated, and transmitted across generations as cultural achievements rather than being recognized as the institutionalized abuse they represented. The Renaissance courts didn't just tolerate these horrors, they perfected them, creating elaborate intellectual frameworks for justifying obvious suffering and sophisticated methods for concealing devastating consequences. The ghosts of these forgotten daughters still whisper through palace corridors, reminding us that the distance between their world and ours might be smaller than we'd like to believe. Their stories force us to confront uncomfortable truths about how societies create and maintain systems of systematic harm while celebrating themselves as civilized and refined. In the end, the true legacy of Renaissance dietary torture isn't found in the portraits of ethereal duchesses or the poetry celebrating aristocratic delicacy. It's written in unmarked graves across Europe, in the silence of history that erased these women's suffering, and in the uncomfortable recognition that human cruelty often wears the mask of sophistication.